Hello, I'm Tom Hanchett. I'm a historian here in Charlotte. I retired recently from Levine Museum of the New South, and before that I worked for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. What I'm going to talk about today is how Charlotte got segregated and some surprising ways that it is unsegregating today. I wrote a book called Sorting Out the New South City that showed that Charlotte became racially and economically segregated around 1900, which is way later than I imagined. I figured it'd be after the Civil War, after Reconstruction in 1875, but actually around 1900, segregation was created. Then, throughout much of the 20th century, people made choices that reinforced segregation until it seemed normal. It seemed like something every city did. By knowing about those choices, today we can make different choices if we so choose. So when I'm talking about segregation, I'm not just talking about racial segregation, I'm talking about economic segregation. This is a map of Mecklenburg County, the crescent and the wedge. Actually, there's a third area, this area up around Lake Norman, that's come into being a wealthy area in just recent years. Not going to talk much about that. I'm going to talk about the crescent here from the airport over to Johnson C. Smith University over to Central Avenue, and the wedge down along the Providence Road corridor from the Center City down to Myers Park, down to South Park Mall, down to Ballantyne. In this area, $45,000 is a very low income. Most of your neighbors are making $70,000, $116,000. This is per capita in 2010. And it's real easy to sort of live in your bubble, to live in your zip code, to go to church, go to school, go to work, and pretty much hang out with people like you. If you live in the Crescent, $45,000 is a lot of money. Most of your neighbors will never make that much money. Many of them are living on as little as $6,000, $20,000. A friend of mine I play music with, Vietnam veteran living on Social Security, makes about $11,000 a year, finding it very hard to live even in the Crescent. So we've got two different Charlottes. And in the fall of 2016, you remember the protests that came after the Keith Lamont Scott shooting, a police-involved shooting, protests that were initially about police relations, but very quickly came about affordable housing, access to jobs, access to good schools, and showed us an anger that is bubbling under this city of prosperity. We are a city where the tide is rising, and the saying is that the rising tide lifts all boats. People in the Crescent often don't feel that. So, was there ever a time when Charlotte was not so divided? Yes, there was. In my research with Historic Landmarks Commission, and then in my book, I documented an era right after the Civil War, 1875, that's 10 years after the end of the Civil War. I mapped land use in a quarter of the city, the first ward. Charlotte had 4 election districts. The whole city was within what's now the I-277 loop. Here's East Trade Street, there's North Tryon Street. Right at the center of town, all those red dots were businesses. Not surprising, you'd expect the businesses to be at Trade and Tryon. What surprised me were the blue dots. These are whites who owned their own business, and they lived everywhere. There was no exclusive neighborhood. There was no wedge. Green pins, middle class folks. Brown pins, working class folks. No economic segregation. White pins, people didn't list what they did in the city directory. Yellow pins, people with a little C next to their name in the city directory, stood for colored. Kind of obnoxious, but it was useful to me because it surprised me. I expected to see one black neighborhood in the first ward. Instead, I found about 5, 6 people here, 4 people there, about 6 people there. But actually, African Americans lived in every single block of Charlotte 10 years after the Civil War. And it wasn't just this neighborhood. I went down to What became the neighborhood of Brooklyn, same pattern. I went ahead in time into the 1890s, same pattern. I went to other southern cities, same pattern, up into the 1890s. And actually, you can see that in Charlotte today. We've turned down so many houses and so many old buildings, but this is Spirit Square today. This is the old First Baptist Church, built right after 1900, right on Trial Street. A block away, here's the Levine Museum of the New South. Right across the street from it is the First United Presbyterian Church. This was built by African Americans right after the Civil War. And at that point, it had whites all around it. And this is the newer building from 1896, built almost the same time, a black church and a white church within a block. If those had been built when I was growing up in the South, they would have been built at opposite sides of town. So a time when we were not segregated. What changed? What was it in the 1890s that disrupted this old pattern? I apologize for showing this next slide. This is from what white Carolina leaders proudly called the White Supremacy Campaign of 1898. What happened in the early 1890s, there was an economic downturn, a depression. Not just a little recession like we had in 2008, but an honest-to-gosh depression. And since 2008, now this could just be me, but has our politics gotten a little uglier? Get an economic downturn and people look for someone to blame. It's their fault. Same thing happened in the 1890s. What happened first actually was pretty cool. It was the fusion. Black and white came together, voted together. African Americans could still vote. They had not yet lost the right to vote. Men of property and standing, the guys at the top of the social pyramid, many of them landowners, some of them former slave owners, they would never vote with African Americans. But this economic downturn inspired ordinary whites, many of them, to vote with African Americans. That's the fusion. Well, as you can imagine, there was a backlash. How dare you take government out of the hands of the men who owned the property and put it in the hands of those who were ignorant and owned no property? That was Charlotte's mayor. Charlotte Observer said it was time to end this rule of Negroes and the lower class of whites. Split the fusion. How do you do that? Charlotte Observer headline, 1898, white supremacy shall be the issue. If you can get white folks to vote white instead of voting their economic interest, you got them. And so there's a whole campaign of propaganda of violence. The largest lynching period in the United States is in the 1890s. But this propaganda, this is the front page of the Raleigh News and Observer, and even if you cannot read and write, many of us couldn't, we were farmers. We learned from our parents. But even if you just looked at the picture, you could see that what had happened, according to the newspaper, was Negro rule, was laying waste to our state. He's got his foot on our ballot box. He's a monster. He's reaching out for our women and children. If you can put sexual fear into your appeal, you've got something powerful. And it worked. 1900, North Carolina put in place a new constitution that said you had to pay to vote. There was a grandfather clause, there was poll. Don't worry about all the names. Who's going to have trouble paying to vote? Not the men of property and standing. And if you could pay to vote, there was one more provision. Doesn't sound like voter suppression. It was a literacy test. Y'all are literate. You could pass a literacy test. Imagine I'm the registrar. You have to read and interpret the Constitution to the satisfaction of the registrar. Black political participation nosedives, does not come back up until the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And white political participation nosedives, does not come back up till the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Well, that's politics. What was happening in cities? The hate, the anger that was unleashed in the 1890s spilled over into all aspects of North Carolina life. This is true across the South, not just in Charlotte. Separate waiting rooms in the train stations, black and white, 1896, first time in Charlotte. Black people sit at the back of the streetcar, later the back of the bus. New North Carolina law, 1903. Down at the courthouse, you swear on a Bible. In court, right? Suddenly there are white and colored Bibles at the Mecklenburg courthouse. And out in the suburbs, there are now deed restrictions. This property shall be used only by members of the Caucasian race for a house costing not less than X number of dollars. Racial segregation, but also economic segregation. And even in established neighborhoods, this is the map I showed you before, black, white, intermingled. This is 1875. I mapped the same area in 1910. Before the white supremacy campaign, same area 10 years after the white supremacy campaign. African American, white. And I don't want to give a sense that there's just one black neighborhood. It's kind of like a quilt, black, white, black, white. But segregation did not just happen. It was not just the market at work. It was not just human nature. It was a reaction to economic stress. And once that genie was out of the bottle, it was hard to put it back again. For the first time, you got separate African American neighborhoods. This is the Brooklyn neighborhood, the old Second Ward. It had been integrated. Now it became the premier, not the only, but the premier black neighborhood. This is J.T. Williams, a political leader. He was top U.S. diplomat to Sierra Leone in West Africa. There's a school named for him. That's his house. That's the Grace A.M.E. Zion Church that he helped build. Second Ward High School was the center of the neighborhood, a black business district. At the other end of the social scale, if you will, Myers Park, laid out in 1911, way out at the edge of town, a treeless cotton farm. They move in the trees, they build mass transit here, and it's a gated neighborhood. No guard at the gate, but those side gates still there up by Novac Presbyterian Hospital. Center ones are gone. And the street system itself. You've been to Myers Park. You ever been lost in Myers Park? I don't think it's an accident. Our street grid breaks down into self-contained neighborhoods that make us feel unwelcome if we're not a resident in that neighborhood. And it gets worse. The 1930s, the Great Depression is on. The mortgage market freezes. Banks don't lend. Remember that from 2008, same thing happened in the 30s. Federal government steps in to help banks, doing something that's now called redlining. And redlining is now illegal. But in the 30s, the federal government did redlining. The idea was actually not the red parts, it was the green parts. If you could pick out the good neighborhoods in every American city, and of course you would do that by talking to the men of property and standing, what do they think they would think were the good neighborhoods? Dilworth, Eastover, Myers Park, Elizabeth, Plaza Midway. Those are the good risk lending neighborhoods. It becomes very easy to buy a home if you live in those neighborhoods. The bad risk neighborhoods are any neighborhoods with African Americans. This is Johnson C. Smith area, college professors, but it's redlined. There is NODA, mill district, a lot of mill workers, white mill workers, but also mill managers. It's redlined. What does that mean? It means that you go down to the bank, you want to buy a home, you have the money for the down payment. The bank looks at that map and they judge you based on your neighborhood. If you live in a red line neighborhood, you probably don't own your own house. Put it another way, around you, absentee landlords. And that's just one part of what happens in the 30s. Also, the Federal Housing Administration, wonderful organization, helps banks make the first long-term mortgages. Used to be you had to pay off your mortgage in 5 years. Suddenly it's 30 years, if you qualify. You qualify by living in a good neighborhood. What's a good neighborhood? They hire a social scientist, Homer Hoyt from Chicago. he maps the good and bad neighborhoods in Chicago. The good neighborhoods are the ones with the English, Germans, Scots, Irish, Scandinavians, maybe North Italians, perhaps Bohemians or Czechoslovakians. Those are my mom's people. I think I'm angry to be third, but maybe I should be happy. Poles, Lithuanians, Greeks, Russian Jews of the lower class, South Italians, Negroes, and Mexicans. Isn't that something? The more you look at them, what are they leaving out? There are no Asian people. There are no Native American people. But what's even more remarkable, the Irish are considered a good group. They have been in the United States long enough to become part of the power structure. There's a difference between North Italians and South Italians. Back in the 30s, everyone knew these differences. We've forgotten some of those. Attitudes towards race can change. But what happened here was the federal government put its stamp of approval on a particular racial hierarchy. And I'm actually in this story. I thought I was the objective historian looking back at the past until my wife and I paid off our house. We own our own house. Great. You paying off your house, you know how much work that is. But when we paid off the house, we realized that one of the reasons we'd been able to get into the house was that my dad gave a loan for part of the down payment. And my dad was able to do that because he owned his own house. If my dad had been one of those ethnic groups, or my dad had chosen to live in an integrated neighborhood, I might not own my own house. History has a momentum. And it gets worse. In the 1950s and 60s, there were a package of federal programs called urban renewal. Great idea. Tear down blighted neighborhoods, makes a better city, right? What's a blighted neighborhood? Well, the definition was a lot of rundown housing, which would be absentee landlord rental housing. Which neighborhoods are those? They tend to be the neighborhoods that were redlined. They tend to be the most important African American neighborhood in every American city. This is Brooklyn. Take a look at that house. That would be worth about $1 million if that was still standing anywhere near the center city today. But it was blighted. Down it goes. 1,000 families displaced. 200 black businesses closed. Most never reopened. And so you end up with hyper-segregation that seems normal. Can you see the wedge? There it is. Can you see the crescent? Used to be a black side of town, that west of Tryon Street, a white side of town. There's Central Avenue. There's South Boulevard. There's Central Avenue. So segregation did not just happen. It's not just the market at work. It's not just human nature. There were choices that people made, which gives us permission to make different choices. And we are. There's the crescent and the wedge. There's 1980. You can see the similarities, right? Flip the script. Look at the differences. Can you find differences? When I came to Charlotte, I came right about 1980, I was told that people with money and choice would never live north of Tryon Street. Look. And out west, on the west side, here we are out the river, there we are near the airport. And on the east side, this is Matthews and Mint Hill. People can make new choices. History has a momentum. You can see the momentum, but you can see that we have choices that we can make. And this is really true when you look at newcomers to this city, particularly newcomers from other nations. We have been growing tremendously quickly. Mecklenburg County went from 500,000 to 1 million in about the last 25 years. We became one of the fastest growing Latino cities in the United States. 1990, we had almost no immigrants. Today, roughly 14-15% of us are foreign born. Not just from Mexico, from India, from Vietnam. Where are folks settling? Take a look at this map. Everything that is pink or red is at least 10% foreign born. This is based on the 2010 census. There's South Boulevard, there's Central Avenue, but also the Mallard Creek area here, the area out by the airport, Ballantyne, Matthews, Mint Hill. People are making new choices. It's easy to miss that if you're in the old wedge. But this is a much more diverse and integrated city than you might imagine. A lot of that has to do with mixed price point housing, mixed income housing. Now that sounds like a liberal thing. It's actually historically how all cities have provided affordable housing. Housing gets old, it gets cheaper. That's historically what's going on. It's called naturally occurring affordable housing. N-O-A-H, naturally occurring affordable housing. Here it is in my neighborhood off of Central Avenue. Rental housing, maybe rental, maybe not. Single family, probably. Apartments. Older, newer. That's why I was able to come to this neighborhood. Came out of college, had no car, didn't make much money. I could live on the east side. Today, I still live on the east side, and I own my own home. Did I mention that? Yes, I did. But what's going on here is that this has become the gateway for many new populations. This is a single shopping center on Central Avenue. Folks from Mexico, from El Salvador, from the Middle East, from Vietnam, from Somalia in Africa. One shopping center. We can come together. And it's not just Central Avenue. You can find the same thing on Potter Road, out by Matthews, Polk Street in Pineville, South Boulevard. And so what is happening in this city is part of what's happening in the United States. By the 2030s, 2040s, white Americans will no longer be a majority in the United States. That's pretty much inevitable at this point. There's a strong incentive for these multiple cultural groups to find ways to work together. In Charlotte, we're ahead of the curve. Like most cities, we are now no longer majority white. 2010, for the first time, African Americans and other people of color are just slightly above 51%. Still more white folks than anybody else. African Americans, second largest group. But for the first time, we are a tremendously diverse city in this place that had almost no immigrants in the middle of the last big immigrant wave. That has not harmed our desirability at all. One of the fastest growing cities in the United States, a place where a rising tide can lift all boats. That's a wonderful saying. Is that going on in Charlotte? I'm going to end with one important sour note, perhaps. The issue of gentrification. There always have been neighborhoods changing, getting more desirable, less desirable. But sometime in the last 10 to 15 years, for reasons no one understands, people with money and choice in every American city have decided that they want to move inward. Charlotte today, within 5 miles of the center city, nearly every neighborhood is seeing displacement of older populations, newer populations coming in. If you own your own house, that can be a great thing. Property values are going up. Did I mention I own my own house? Looks pretty good if you're sitting in the homeowner's seat when a new neighbor comes in, puts investment in an old neighborhood like this. But what if you're a renter? How long are you going to stay in that neighborhood? What if you are a grandma living on a fixed income? How long are you going to be able to stay in that neighborhood? So what's going on today is a new set of choices. No one knows how it's going to shake out. No one is in charge of this. What's going on right now is not being planned by one central government entity. That kind of is what happened during urban renewal. What's happening now is all of us are making choices about where we go to school, where we go to work, if we're business owners, where we place our businesses. What choices will you make as you make history in today's Charlotte?